Hi, my name is Joe Lott, and I'd like to discuss with you for a few minutes this evening Ernest Hemingway and how his life and the events of his life impacted directly his writings, and especially the writing that we had this week, Hills Like White Elephants. So, Ernest Hemingway was born in July 21st, 1899. You can find a lot of the content of his life and his biographies, which are all over the internet. I found, and I'm going to discuss some of the content that I found from that. But I found an interesting article, and I wanted to share mostly his life through the discovery of that article. That was from the New Yorker. It was actually written in May 13th, 1950, by Lillian Ross, who was able to spend an evening with Mr. Hemingway as he was traveling from his residence in Cuba to Italy. Apparently, he did not like New York, and he was a very private person, and it seemed that she was very fortunate to even be able to have this experience as private of a person as he seemed. Now, Mr. Hemingway, we can find out, began his career at the age of 17, right out of high school, as a newspaper writer. And this is where he developed something that was important for him throughout his career, which was the iceberg theory. Basically, the iceberg theory states that that the theme of a writing should not be discussed straight out, but should rather be an underlying thing underneath, just like the shape of an iceberg. That the actual content itself is what we see on above the surface, but the underlying themes are very broad and very deep underneath the actual content that we see. And he was an expert at this, as we can see in Hills with White Elephants. The underlying theme is not evident at first. It actually took a couple of readings for me to find out exactly what he was writing about, and a little bit of research on my part to see exactly what his theme was. But he's able to expertly craft most of his writings in this way, especially his short stories. And he developed this through his time as a newspaper reporter. And we also see throughout his life that he enjoyed being a writer. He wrote for during World War II as well. He wrote during the Spanish War as a war correspondent. Incidentally, this is also where he met most of his wives. He was married 4 times, which we'll get into a little bit later. So during this article that this lady wrote for the New Yorker, she spent some time with him and was able to just experience him and his conversation, his thoughts on the world in a very kind of free-flowing, organic kind of way. And I feel like this gave more of a feel for who the man actually was, or at least at this point in his career. At this point, this was 1950. He was already very well-respected and celebrated journalist and writer and author, novelist. So he had a very stated circle at this point. So, but she was fortunate enough to be a part of that, and so in the midst of this article, we kind of journey through the scenes of New York for a night with him. And in that, I was able to see that he was a very private person, but there are a few people that he allowed into his circle that he respected. He talks a lot about his experiences as a hunter. He was well known as a sportsman, and also as being involved in war. And a lot of the characters that he writes about are these heroic, very masculine characters: bullfighters, soldiers, sportsmen. These very masculine men. I found it interesting in the book that we read, Hills Like White Elephants, that he kind of takes a turn from this. Though most of his characters have kind of a courage that's set against the world, and they find that the dark kind of cultures of the world kind of are set against the heroic, courageous nature that they have, and it is a little bit depressing sometimes. He takes a turn from that in Hills Like White Elephants, where the character that he has there is very strong and masculine, but a little bit misogynist, really a lot of bit misogynist. He is very domineering and controlling of the female character that's in the story. Eventually for all intent and purposes, forcing her to have an abortion, and mentally controlling her in order to affect that. It was interesting during this article that the women that surrounded him, his wife Mary, his fourth wife at the time, and another lady that joins their party later on, all referred to him as Papa. Now, he had a circle of novelists and people that he allowed to be around him, and I think that they all had these certain nicknames for themselves and for each other, but apparently his nickname was Papa. And I found it interesting that there's a little bit of a kind of a misogynistic, male domineering undertone to that the ladies would, willfully, this was written in 1950, but they would willfully refer to him, and I think that he probably had those issues, and he was sort of dealing with the idea of that as he wrote Hills with White Elephants. He had 4 wives. He probably did not respect women, but I think he was intelligent enough to realize that that was a character flaw that he had, and I think that this novel was a bit of an exploration of that. He also had the same drink. It's interesting during this interview that the characters in the story have the liquor with water, basically, so it must have been a drink of his choice. Which leads to the next point, was that he seems to write from experience. During the extent of this interview, a few times he critiques other writers, his contemporaries, who are writing, but they're not writing from experience. They're war novelists and war journalists, but he points out that they've never been in war and they've never seen war, and he really makes a point of showing that he frowns upon that and does not look up to that. So we kind of gathered that he's had a very rich life. He's made a point of being where the action is, and that is where the content of his stories comes from, is from the experiences of his life, that he very much writes from experience, and he frowned on anybody that did not write from experience. So again, in Hills with White Elephants, we see that the setting was in Spain. Mr. Hemingway spent a lot of time in Europe. So I'm sure that those hills with like white elephants, I'm sure that he traveled by hills that looked like white elephants, and could have been what was the birth of the story to begin with. But at any rate, I think that the experience of his own life, of perhaps misogyny that he wrestled with, and the setting itself are all things that he experienced firsthand in his own life. So we can see that those are the things that define the man, and also those are the things that we see bleed through into the writing. In Hills with White Elephants especially, I think that the male domineering culture, which was his experience, and I think especially this iceberg theory, which is most known in his short stories, we very much see come alive in this. That the theme is just not evident, but it's there just below the surface, and it's masterfully woven by him. In just a few short pages, we see a very deep and compelling and dark story of something that's happened that he shares with us, that he draws us, the readers, into that world. So I hope that you were able to learn something from this. I have also provided the link on this YouTube page to that article from the New Yorker. It was very interesting just to be able to spend an evening with Mr. Hemingway himself, and see just the way that he spent his life and the way that he communicated with people. So I hope that you learned a little something about him, and also the way that his life has impacted his writings. So thank you very much.